Hey you and welcome. My name is Mike, and in this old podcast, which I'm recording as rain batters my window, kind of setting the mood over here. Light a candle, take your shoes off, you pop a squat, stay a while. Are we gonna? No, let's get back into it. In this whole episode of the podcast, I have two stories of business gone bad. But imagine instead of declaring bankruptcy, you're declaring death. This is how business partners turned on each other. Imagine Succession, but less rich, more blood. Because that's exactly what I have for you in these tales. One in Delaware, the other in Southern Cali. And both, well, I don't know if going into business is a good way to make friends, but it's an excellent way to make enemies because money talks and guns do too, to be honest. But they only speak bang bang. I mean, some of the lads in here, they wouldn't work for the life of them. They wouldn't work on batteries, except when it came to hiring assassins. That sure as shit lit a fire under their ass. So let's give it a go. So let's do something, just absolutely off the wall and begin at the beginning with the Connell family of Wilmington, Delaware. The Connells were a family of five until they weren't when the parents split. There were three Connell children. You got your John, the oldest. You got your Joseph, Joey, how you doing, as he liked to be called. He was the middle kid, and then Kelly, the youngest. They were a tight-knit family, but at the same time, always fighting over one thing or another. They be the kind of family that would look out for each other in the kind of way where it's like, you can't beat the shit out of my sibling, only I can beat the shit out of them. That kind of way. They grew up on a sizable piece of land in the great state of Delaware. They were adventurous, stunty, active. Now Joey, the middle child, he was the life of the party. A big happy head in him, but he could also be, sometimes a bit of a shit, obnoxious, but it wasn't always in a bad way. He was the kind of guy who was very fun at parties, right? But you kind of want to leave him at the party, like he's winding up when everybody else is winding down. And Joey, he was doing pretty well for himself. He was the co-owner of CNS Auto Service, along with one of his friends named Christopher Rivers. And then Joey met Olga. She was Russian, all the way from Siberia, so easily impressed. Look, a toilet! They met online, don't know how much she paid, that's a joke, and Olga actually fit in with the Connells right away. They loved her, she was a sweetheart. Joey and Olga, they seemed like such a great couple, but Olga wouldn't have come all this way for just a great couple. It seemed like wedding bells were in the air. And that's when the problems began. Like the problems began and they were straight out of Tolkien because it was all over our ring. Jackie, who was the mother of the Connell family, the matriarch, the mother of the children. Remember, she had split from the father. The parents had divorced. Well, Jackie had given her wedding ring to her daughter, Kelly, the youngest. Here, Kelly, this is for you for when you get married. The ring was worth about $20,000, so Sauron's kind of looked like a ring pop in comparison. Jackie, however, she then came back. She took the ring from Kelly and she gave it to Joey. Joey then had the diamonds removed from the ring and fashioned into an engagement ring for Olga. Then they replaced the original diamonds with zirconia and gave it back to Kelly. This is a kind of a dick move, and it's relatively easy to spot the difference between zirconia and real diamonds. So that didn't fool Kelly at all. I mean, some people say it's not. It truly is. Zirconia does not sparkle like real diamonds. You really do need the horrific human rights abuses to get that shine. Joey and Olga, they then married in a small ceremony on the US Virgin Islands. Very fancy, the auto shop must have been doing well, and Olga, by this stage, she was a receptionist at the place. Kelly didn't attend, but she did send some nasty texts to Olga, and, Olga had no idea about this whole ring, fighting over this ring business at all, so she had no clue what Kelly was so pissed at her for. And so began kind of a nasty back and forth between Joey and his sister Kelly. And a few weeks later, someone broke into Joey and Olga's home, and a fair bit of Olga's jewelry was stolen, including some family heirlooms. But Olga, she was wearing the engagement ring and they were out at the time, so that wasn't taken. Bet somebody was pissed about that though, that the ring wasn't there, and it didn't take a rocket scientist to figure out who had broken in to their place to try and steal back the diamonds. Joey, he called the police and they said, yeah, we'll look into it. Then September 2013 came along, 3 months after the wedding, and shots rang out outside Joey and Olga's Wilmington condo. On September 22nd, 2013, in the very wee hours, talking about 2 a.m., 911 calls started coming in. Folk living in the Paladin Club condos, northeast Wilmington, almost on like the Delaware River, they had heard some scary shit. Olga was found lying outside the apartment, having been shot a few times. She was still alive, but wouldn't be for long. She would pass away on the way to the hospital. In the bushes beside was Joey. He too had been shot. He had been shot in the back of the head. It seemed like Olga and Joey had been returning home after a night out on the town. Olga's key was still in the latch when they had been ambushed, and it looked like they had been executed. And the investigation into the burglary, that was still ongoing, so it didn't take, too much time to put 2 and 2 together. Except Olga still had the ring on her. This day, the day they were killed, was Olga's 39th birthday. It seemed that the people who had reported the shots fired, they weren't exactly too keen on looking out the window. Nobody had seen anything, but heard the 20 shots that had been fired. They heard 2 male voices, and it sounded like there had been some kind of fight or something. It would later seem like 2 guys had been waiting for the newlyweds as they came back from the bar. So, the investigation began, and the police went to speak with Joey's mother and his stepfather. And funnily enough, Kelly just happened to be there at that very moment. So, as you can imagine, right, old Kelly became the big cheese, the numero uno persono. Was she pissed over the ring? A ring, by the way, that wasn't even taken from the crime scene. But was the ring not taken because it would have been obvious if it had been taken, right? You be the judge. Until I tell you what I tell you. Then you can be the judge again. Now Kelly, when she was questioned about this, a person with a kind of an obvious motive for wanting them dead, she was very happy to open up about the family feud. She even showed detectives some of the nasty texts that had been sent between them. She wasn't trying to downplay what had gone on, wasn't trying to hide a thing. And she didn't make the police not want to look at her. As for an alibi, Kelly said she was recovering from cancer treatment that day. But regardless, it seemed to have been done by 2 lads, so she didn't need to be there. Police would speak with Kelly many times, but each time it seemed they were getting nowhere. So either she was a great liar, or they needed to start looking at other possibilities. Possibilities like this had nothing to do with the family at all, and maybe something to do with Joey and Olga's private lives. Police started widening the net, learning a little bit more about likable, gregarious, and generous Joe, and they spoke with his business partner, Chris Rivers. He had a little bit of a different view, though, of Joe than others kind of did. For example, when the police went to speak with him, the first thing Chris Rivers said was, "What did he do now?" Well, what has he done before, huh? When they asked him to come down to the station, the day of the murders, they hadn't told him Joey and Olga had been killed. They did tell him pretty quickly, though. In fact, Chris told the police he was supposed to meet them that night they were at the bar, but he didn't make it as he forgot the LID.
At 11, I went down there. It was around 10:30. But I didn't have my ID on me, so I had to drive all the way home.
Chris would give the police, he would tell them about some of the rumors he had heard of maybe trouble Olga was in. See, Olga, she'd been married once before, and maybe that didn't end so well. Or maybe she was involved with the Russian mafia. After all, it seemed like the Connells had a lot of money. More than you would think on the salaries that they actually had. Like the business had been doing well, but not that well. So they were either writing checks their ass you couldn't cash, or there was something else here. Another source of income, not strictly legal in the dictionary sense of the word. And maybe Joey would have some connections. See, before he met Olga, Joey had spent a few years in prison on gun charges. Basically what happened is he got into a bar fight, he was pissed off, he left the bar, he went and grabbed a shotgun from his car and started walking back towards the bar with the shotgun when cops just happened to drive by. So he served time for that. And there is where he made some friends. And once outside, he hadn't forgotten them. And that explained where the money was coming from. Joey Connell was selling steroids on the side. This was confirmed by both Kelly and Chris to be a possible reason for the killings. Now steroids though, while illegal, it's not exactly Breaking Bad type stuff. But it was something. Some tips, they led the police to a guy named Harry Cook, who worked around the place. He popped in and out. It seemed he himself was interested in becoming a partner at the auto store. In fact, he'd already invested over $100,000 into the place, and he also lived near the Connells. However, he had an alibi, this Harry guy. He had an alibi, he was out of town at the time. So dead ends all around. And it was around then that Chris Rivers gave an interview.
Figures you see somebody every day, 12 hours a day more than you see your wife. So we were pretty much best friends.
When was the last thing you did together?
I was together Friday with him. And then Saturday I was supposed to meet him down with everybody at the bar. He's a great guy. There's nothing that he would ever do to make anybody angry, ever.
Did you do anything that night? Did you go out anywhere?
I was at work and then I went straight in.
That interview raised some eyebrows due to this one thing. He said,
What'd you guys do that night?
Went to bed.
You didn't go straight home.
I went to McDonald's and brought food home to her.
Now where were you the night before?
At home. At work, to the shop, to home.
Yet in the police interview, he said,
At 11, I went down there. It was around 10:30. But I didn't have my ID on me, so I had to drive all the way home.
See, he told the police he was supposed to meet them that night, but he forgot his ID. Weird. It turned out that, unlike, as Chris said in the interview, that they were BFFs, Chris was often bitching and moaning about Joey and was accusing him of embezzlement, of stealing from the shop. Police went through the books and found the store was losing money despite a large income. So maybe somebody was stealing from the shop. But it wasn't Joe, it was Chris. As usual, the person who flings shit at somebody and accuses somebody of something, a lot of times they're the ones who are actually doing it. See, Chris had an opioid addiction. He was stealing money from the shop to fund that. That's where the money was going. And so the police started looking into Chris maybe more. Now, he was home during the murder, and this was confirmed via his home security. Something Chris was like, he was very eager for the police to see, hey, you can see I'm home. Here's my fucking CCTV. Check it out, right? I was home. Couldn't have shot anyone. Though in the footage of Chris in his house, it seemed like he had ants in his pants that night. For some reason. Now, on his phone, they learned a lot of calls had been made that night. But the call logs had been deleted. It's pretty easy for the police to undelete them, and they found out that the night of the murder, Chris had been calling a Josh Bay. Josh Bay, customer at the shop, but also Chris's drug dealer. Now, Josh Bay, he had a history, but he didn't pull the trigger either. His alibi did match up, he couldn't have been there. But maybe Josh Bay knew he did, as Josh Bay had made some calls that night to a Dominique Benson and an Aaron Thompson. So at this point, it looked like Aaron and Dominique may have pulled the trigger. Josh asked them to, Chris asked him to. Chris hated Joe. But still, not quite there yet. So what's the rest of the story? Well, this. Chris Rivers, he had a huge debt, and he was pissed off at Joe. So Chris hired his drug dealer, Josh Bay, to kill the Connells. Josh then hired Aaron and Dominique. Chris was hoping to collect on a $1 million insurance policy that Chris and Joey had taken out on each other for the mortgage, for their auto shop. And Chris had been texting Joe all the night of the murders, asking where he was and when he'd be home. Information he relayed to Josh Bay, who in turn passed it on. The puzzle finally came together when Josh Bay agreed to a deal. He told the police that Chris had approached him about having the couple killed, and even provided a $5,000 down payment, with a promise of $60,000 more once the murders were complete. 1 year after the murders, Chris Rivers was charged with conspiracy and 2 counts of murder. He went on trial 19 months later. It did not go well for Chris at all. The Chris who had tried to use Joe's steroid abuse to cover up his tracks hoped the family feud with Carrie would cover his tracks. And remember that break-in that happened shortly after they got married, where it seemed like somebody had broken into the house, stolen some jewelry, and was actually looking for the engagement ring? Well, that was all Chris Rivers. That was all him. Chris had Josh Bay break into their home to steal jewelry, thinking Carrie would get the blame. In the end, all was revealed. Aaron Thompson got 2 life sentences. Dominique Benson was acquitted of murder charges, but got 5 years for conspiracy. Josh Bay got 5 years. And Chris was sentenced to 2 life sentences in prison. And there you have it. Quite a convoluted plot with guys covering their old tracks. Chris Rivers, he had it all planned out. And he got lucky. I mean, he got lucky for a bit, because the pile of shit landed straight back on his doorstep, just as it should. And now, for the next story I have for you. And this one, my friends, is a doozy. So let me begin with a hot tip for you folks. Be careful who you go into business with. Okay, right, not the most groundbreaking tip to be fair. And here's another one. Be careful about the emails you receive, because sometimes you just never know who's the one actually sending them. Chris Smith was a real Cali surfer dude. He said cowabunga all the time, I believe. He grew up in Watsonville, Central California, along with the family, close family to be sure. They were super active and adventurous type. They grew up beside a lake, and when they weren't wakeboarding, they'd be out there on the Pacific Ocean. Chris, he was a nice guy, a very helpful dude. He grew up in wealth, but he wasn't afraid to share. He became a professional wakeboarder for a short time until an injury ended that banjaxed his Achilles. And later he went to college and discovered he knew how to make money. Especially in this thing called the internet. Have you heard of it? Gonna be big. In 2009, Chris moved to Laguna Beach, Los Angeles, and there he founded a company called the 800 Exchange with his partner, Edward Shin. Now, Edward Shin, Ed Shin, was the son of Korean immigrants and a very high achiever. The 800 Exchange was a digital advertising company. I mean, you called in, they sell your information on, but it managed to secure some big clients pretty quick, pretty early into the business. This led to Chris, getting into the cha-ching lifestyle. He would take friends, family with him on exotic trips, surfing in Tahiti, that sort of thing. Now, Chris and Ed, they made a very good team, hence why the business was so successful. Even though they were quite different from each other, they really matched. Chris, right? On one hand, you got Chris, surfing partier, the jokester, the people person. Go around wearing jeans and a t-shirt. Ed, the businessman. He had a head for numbers and he wore designer suits. Chris, single like a Pringle, for the most part. Ed, married with kids. Now, Chris, he would often talk about something he called the moo. The moo! Well, folks, if you have to ask, you're already one of them. Basically what Chris called sheeple. Worker drones, right? You know that. People who do what the man tells them. Believe the lamestream media. Folks who live to work and didn't work to live. All that. See, Chris believed the shit was gonna hit the fan. He invested in gold, physical goods, not in the stock market bullshit, and he had escape plans for when the machines took over and forced you to whatever the Matrix forces people to do. Point is, Chris was, he was an adventurous guy. And he was prepared to leave it all and backpack around the world. Get busy surfing or get busy dying. And as summer 2010, came along, it seemed, okay, the apocalypse wasn't quite hitting just yet, but the moo, as Chris called it, it was getting to him. He was starting to feel trapped, right? The business was doing really well. It was taking off. He was rolling in, the dollar bills. But at what cost? His surfing trips, which were so important to him, they became further and further apart. The walls, they were closing in on the free-spirited Chris Smith. He would rather be a bartender on the beach than rich, but working 80 hours a week. Which, I mean, kind of easy to say that when you're already rich, but okay. Something needed to change. And then, one day, Chris was gone. It was in June 2010 that Chris's brother and his family arrived home from a vacation. Chris, he was supposed to pick them up from the airport, but he never showed to give them a ride. He just upped and left, surfboard in tow. Well, actually, no, not in tow. Now that you mention it, he left his surfboard at home. Weird, but he left, leaving no notes or explanation for the family. Maybe he thought, they might talk him out of leaving, so he didn't want to say anything. And so the family, they couldn't get in touch with him. They spoke to Chris's business partner, Ed. And Ed told the family, it turned out that Chris, he'd cashed out. Ed had bought him out of the 800 exchange for $1 million and had done a legger. It was a few days later that Chris's parents got the first email. June 7, 2010. I'm going on a vacation, probably 3-week trip to Galapagos Islands and Costa Rica. I'll let you know for sures by Friday. Love you guys. Okay, fair enough. His parents replied, well, good for you. Go for it, right? Go ahead there, live your best life, and enjoy, go on adventures. Be sure to send us pics. Let us know when you'll be back. Like I said, it was startlingly sudden, but it was Chris. Kind of just the way he wasn't the most shocking thing in the world. Then it turned out he had dumped his girlfriend he had been seeing, one that he had reportedly been pretty mad about, like she was marriage material, and it turned out he had dumped his girlfriend over text. Yeah, not a good move. And then, while he was away on this trip, he emailed his brother a picture of this woman with big ass titties saying, hey, like what you see? Now her name was Tiffany Taylor, a former Playboy playmate. Like, whoa, super hot. Like, lads listening, give her a Google, you won't be disappointed. And they were thinking, wow, he's doing pretty well for himself. Okay, he dumped this girl he was in love with over text and now is dating this super hot model. But, Chris wasn't the model. He didn't go for the models. Like, that just wasn't his type at all. But, okay, sure. The family received more emails over the following weeks and months, and it sounded like he was having a grand old time, right? July 12, 2010. Hey guys, just finally docked in Ushuaia, a port in Argentina, for a few hours, so I found an internet cafe. Amazing sailing for the past 2 weeks. We are on a 45-foot sailing yacht, so there's no internet or phones, just us and the sea. The islands we've sailed around are amazing. I'm going to get a list from the captain and send them next time I get online. I'm going to look for a camera to buy too so I can send pics. I made the mistake of not buying one when I was in Chile. I think I'll be back early to mid-August. We have about 20 to 25 more islands to explore, and I want to get back up to Buenos Aires, and from there either fly back or go to Brazil and fly back. Paul, that's the brother of Chris, wish you were here with me, bro. It's gnarly how nice it is. Probably better than the South Pacific. Except the surf, since most islands don't have the beaches for it. Galapagos was incredible though, definitely blows away Costa Rica. Chris. It seems like he was extending his voyage, couldn't stop traveling. But the strangest thing was that he never called. They never heard his voice. He gave an explanation in one of these emails, basically saying he didn't want one, he didn't want to have to talk to anybody at all, just wanted to get away, clear his noodle. It was around the second month into the trip that things were looking a little bit fishy. Now, remember, this trip was supposed to be just a couple of weeks long, Chris's trip. It was ever extending. Chris's dad, especially, who was a former cop, thought the emails just felt a little bit off. Something about them was no bueno. It was in late August that Chris's dad sent an email basically asking Chris questions. Hey, if you are really my son, okay, what boat did we used to own? What lake did we used to live beside? Where we went wakeboarding. Stuff, only Chris would know. And he answered. In an email reply, Chris answered. He answered one of the questions anyway. They used to live beside Kelly Lake. The other questions that Chris's dad asked, he kind of just sidestepped them. But they bought it, seemed okay, yeah, well, it's Chris. Happy days. So, months continued to roll by. Summer turned to autumn, and Chris was still traveling around the place. The business, the 800 Exchange, was doing well. Chris's brother, Paul, he actually worked for the company. Chris had gotten him on the board early when it was starting out. Then, in October, Ed Shin, now sole CEO of the company, flew the entire staff out to Las Vegas as kind of a half-company retreat/party, half meetings with investors. And it was while they were there, and Paul obviously is an employee, he went too. Well, in Las Vegas, who did Paul happen to run into? Well, the woman who was supposed to be traveling South America with Chris, former Playboy playmate Tiffany Taylor. Huh. So Paul, seen her, we're in one of the casinos, he went over, he was like, hey, it's me, you know my brother, right Chris? He was dying to chat with her. Hey, how's Chris getting on? Haven't talked to him in ages. Tiffany Taylor looked at Paul like he had two heads. And now the emails from Chris, who had left South America and continued on his travels to Africa, India and Europe. Well, now Chris was sending a little bit different. He was sending depressed. He was using drugs. He was sending suicidal. This past year and a half was such a nightmare for me, and I even contemplated doing some unspeakable things. I was so stressed, angry, scared, and confused. That was one email he sent. However, the emails kept coming, and he was kind of like all over the place. Next he had a great idea for business. Next he wanted his brother to join him in Costa Rica. But then, before he could, he said he had some business in Africa to take care of. But the business was shady and dangerous. See, he said he was going to sell the gold he'd invested in to start up a new business. And then, on December 26th, he sent this to his brother. Just realized it's Christmas. Is it snowing in Bend, Oregon, where his brother lived? It's summer down here with it being so warm. I'm headed back up through the Congo. I'll be offline for a couple of weeks. Paid some dude $100 just to be online, lol. I found a dealer in Rwanda that will pay a 30% markup on gold Krugerrands. And that was it. After that, Chris never sent another email. His family, they became sick with worry then. His mother even began scrolling message boards in Rwanda in hopes of learning something about her son. And it was in March 2011 that he was reported missing. He hadn't been seen in 9 months. Heard from in 3 months. Chris's dad contacted the US State Department and forwarded Chris's emails, basically hoping they could track down where Chris's passport had last been used. A few weeks later, they got back in touch. Chris's passport had last been used years ago. He never left America. Contacting Ed Shin, one of the last people to see Chris, of course, when he bought him out, Ed said that Chris had been in contact with some sort of fixer who had given Chris a fake passport. Now, why Chris would want or need a fake passport, I don't know, but that's why Ed Shin said his passport never appeared on, any customs, immigration, anything like that. It was then the Laguna Beach Police Department took over the case. And they spoke to Ed, who said, yeah, he signed the papers, basically where I would buy him out of the company. Then Chris got really drunk, he pissed and puked all over the office, and then he left, never to see him again. And that was that. Now, it was a month or two before Chris was reported missing, in January 2011, that someone needed some money from the 800 Exchange. See, the company, the 800 Exchange, had just left out of their office, doing the landlord out of 40 grand in unpaid rent. Where Ed Shin's company went, nobody knew. So, luckily for the landlord, right beside where the 800 Exchange office was, there was a private detective's office. So they took on the case of trying to find where, the company had gone and discover what assets they had. The landlord was not going to let them get away with 40 grand, in unpaid rent. And it didn't take long to find out where Ed Shin had taken the company, another business park just a few miles down the road. They learned, too, that Chris, remember, former co-founder who's now missing, well, they learned about this, and so the private detective starting to think this is very, very fishy. The company just ups and leaves 40 grand in rent that they owe to the landlord, and one of the co-owners of the business is a missing person. This is shady. And so the private investigator, one Joe Dalu, former cop, he started looking into the Chris Smith disappearance, contacting the family. He immediately got the vibe that the emails were phony. And one day, he asked if he could look around the old 800 Exchange office, something the landlord told him the police never did. Snooping around, they went into what would have been Chris's office and saw small, dark stains on the light switch and door jamb. Dark stains that looked like blood. The police were alerted and used good old luminol, and the office lit up like crazy. Then, taking some samples, they were able to confirm it was indeed Chris's blood. And it turned out that in the weeks before Chris took his trip, he'd wanted to get out of the company. Not because he wanted to, escape and go off and wander beaches. No, Chris had wanted to get out of the company because he learned Ed Shin was shady as shit. Ed Shin, he had some money problems. Long before the 800 Exchange existed, he had met with a man named Joseph Gray through a church they both attended. This Joseph Gray took Ed under his wing, and he gave him a job at his company, LG Technologies. However, Ed Shin later, as an employee, he started pocketing bits and bobs. He changed the account information so that, when companies were supposed to pay LG Technologies, the money actually went to Ed's bank account. About $2 million. He was pocketing a little bit on the side. This would lead to a big scandal, and Ed would have to pay back $700,000 or else go to jail. He had more scandals behind him. Another one was that Ed owed $117,000 to a company that printed out a sports memorabilia magazine for him. He owed thousands of dollars to his banks thanks to his gambling addiction, about $187,000. He basically bled cash and owed money all over town. And it seemed Chris had found out about this, wanted out, agreeing to sell to Ed Shin. Chris went, signed the papers, apparently, because when Ed Shin said Chris went and signed the papers, nobody else was there in the office. An office that the police learned was covered in blood. On August 28th, 2011, Ed Shin was boarding a plane to Canada. The plane was actually taxiing off when he was arrested. He was still on probation for embezzlement, and leaving was a violation. So they got him on that, but they didn't really give a shit. They wanted to know one thing from Ed Shin. What happened and where was Chris Smith? Ed Shin eventually admitted to police he had killed Chris, but it had nothing to do with money, he said. It was in the heat of the moment. They'd gotten drunk together, they'd argued in the office late one night, and Ed pushed Chris, who fell, cracked his head. Blood was everywhere, and not knowing what to do, Ed Shin said he called a associate, some Russian guy he never named, to go and get rid of the body. That was his story, and he was sticking to it. Ed Shin and Chris did meet up on June 4th, 2010. Now, what happened then, nobody really knows. But an email was sent to Chris's lawyer, saying, the buyout wasn't for $1 million as agreed. It was for $30,000 and 10 gold coins worth about $15,000. So a fair bit less than what it would have been worth. Sounds like an email Chris would not have sent to his lawyer. Then, Ed rented a truck and drove 170 miles to an area east of San Diego near the Mexican border. He did that twice. Now, this was found via mobile phone pings. So Ed obviously never called a guy to disappear the body for him. Ed disappeared the body himself. When asked about these trips, Ed said it was because he wanted to flee to Mexico, but he couldn't do it at the last moment. So instead, he started sending emails. Then, the week after this meeting in June 2010, when Ed Shin and Chris had this meeting, Ed Shin insisted all employees work from home that week so the office could be professionally cleaned. Of course, Ed said this was because Chris got super drunk and basically demolished the place. When blood was actually noticed by the cleaners, Ed said he cut his arm. So the entire story was thought to be bullshit, obviously. If Chris fell and hit his head, well, why was there blood on the goddamn ceiling, for example? Rather, what actually happened was that Chris wanted to get out of the company. He did not want to be in business with Ed Shin anymore. But Ed Shin was not going to buy Chris out. After all, he had his own myriad debts. So he killed him, disappeared the body somewhere near the Mexican border, and then covered up, the disappearance and murder for months, emailing Chris's family, pretending to be him. Ed Shin then got full control of the company and all assets, used these assets to pay off his debts and solve his own problems. Police went to where Ed Shin's phone went in the middle of the desert in an attempt to find Chris's body. And they also thought that finding his body would tell a different story to what Ed was saying. But they never found Chris Smith's body. Like, if Ed Shin was telling them the truth, that it was an accident, that he pushed Chris and he cracked his head, it was an accidental death, accidental murder, whatever, manslaughter. Well, Ed Shin should have showed the police where Chris's body was so it could back up his statement of it being an accident. Did he? Did he, fuck?
I think that's when he grabbed me.
How did he grab you?
He made a move towards my throat.
Did he place his hands on you?
Yes. I'm just trying to avoid him, not really fight him initially. But then he lunged at me again. And I think either, he hit me or something, but it just, at that point, I felt I had to fight back. I just sidestepped and I grabbed him. And I remember just turning around and swinging him into his office as hard as I could.
And were you able to throw him into his office?
Yes.
And what happened to when he went into his office?
I think he took a couple steps and that's when he fell and he hit the desk really hard.
What did you do next?
I remember freaking out. I remember, saying, "Oh my God," I said that a bunch of times, standing there.
Mr. Shin, looking back at this situation, do you regret the things that you did after the fight?
Everything.
Why?
Because it was wrong on every level, not to call the police, not to trust that everything would have sorted itself out, to completely deceive family.
Ed Shin went on trial in 2018, 7 years after he was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. The jury returned with a verdict after less than an hour and found Ed Shin guilty. He was sentenced to life in prison. Ed Shin still sticking to his story that it was an accident, and he has no idea what happened to Chris's body. After all, an associate, quote-unquote, took it, so he no knowledge of where it was. Coming up with all this stupid shit. Kind of just like what Chris Rivers did in Delaware, concocting this whole plot to cover up what really went wrong. I'm not really too sure at the end of this one what we're supposed to learn from these two stories. Not much, I guess. Murder bad. Who knew? Thank you so much for listening. I really appreciate you taking the time to listen to this old podcast. I hope you enjoyed it. Also, folks, just a bit of an update. Starting next week, the That Chapter podcast will only be posted on Mondays, so just going down to one a week for the next while. The reasons for this are multifold. Well, I'm actually going to be away, traveling on my honeymoon pretty soon, so I'll be away for a couple of weeks, and I don't want to, be posting 2 a week and then leave you guys with nothing, so I'm going to spread out the next couple of episodes, so it'll just be posting episodes on Mondays. No Fridays episodes, so just check them out on Mondays. Please give them a go. And also, another reason is I'm going back to 2 YouTube episodes every week, if you can believe that. Well, okay, I'm not saying every week. It'll be most weeks. One of the reasons I went down to 1 YouTube video a week back in November, I went down to 1 a week, was I was actually feeling a little bit burnt out of doing it all the time. I was a little bit exhausted, so I took a little break there for the last 6-ish months, and now I'm ready to get back on the horse. So 2 YouTube videos most weeks, because, I don't want to put myself under that kind of pressure like I used to. So check it out. So for the next while, going forward, it will be 2 YouTube videos, Tuesdays, Fridays at 3 p.m. Eastern, and a new That Chapter podcast episode on Monday. So please give it a go wherever you get your stuff. But until the next one, as always, please take care of each other and yourselves, because I love you. Mike out.